Hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's seminar, The Singularity of Stanley Aronowitz. The event is co-sponsored by the MA program in Liberal Studies, on which Stanley was a faculty member, as well as the Institute for the Radical Imagination, which Michael Pelias, Stanley, and myself co-founded together with some other comrades a few years ago. There in the back, whichever is left, there are some back issues of our journal Situations, of which I encourage people to subscribe to and to read. It's also free online for people who don't want to pay money. Everything is free online. We're going to have lunch for those people who know. One of the principles that Stanley and the rest of us live by is nothing is too good for the working class. So we have, and Stanley would always stop me and say, and especially their representatives, which is of course true. But so we'll have for Italy, we'll cater lunch, and we have wine and different things for later on. So for now, I'd like to introduce David Humphreys, who is the executive officer of the MA in Liberal Studies program, where I also teach, as well as being a member of the board of the Institute. And I encourage everyone to come to study in the MALS programs and, learn all kinds of wonderful things. But David.
So I'm an English professor. I'll try to be really brief. It's tough for me though. So, well, first of all, it's a great honor to be here. I was thinking, I have 3 points. So the first one, if you'll indulge me, is a little personal. So I'm from Youngstown, Ohio. If you study labor study, you may know a bit about it. If not, you can ask me later. But it was, when I was born, it was Steel City. And when I left, it was Crime Town. So it was pretty tough. And when I was a little kid, we used to call, the older folks would call the soot pay dirt because it meant you're getting paid from the steel mills. My dad worked at Republic Steel. And I lived about 2 blocks, about 200 yards from the Ohio Leather Works, which closed before the steel mills. And when I was about 5 or 6, one of the big industries in Youngstown was arson. So someone torched it, and I was out playing with my brother in the yard, and just ashes and cinders started coming out of the sky. And in my mind, I kind of associate those 2 images, the soot that paid for things and the ashes when they started burning things down. So I was thinking about Stanley and sort of how many people address all of those things, what it means to be in a union, what it means to be or try to be a working class intellectual, what it means to be a public intellectual, and I should say what it means to think about the environment and other things more broadly, because the soot wasn't really great for the lungs and other things, even though it did bring those paydays. Second thing I was kind of thinking is I'm kind of odd, just the people in the room and the people whose spirit are in the room. I think any one of us who had an uncertain or a difficult journey, we kind of look for those leading lights. Obviously Stanley being one of those for many of us, but I guess being a bit of a punk rock and a jazz fan, those 2 things, I like to be in the room with people. Peter's saying to try to get as many people here, and you feel the energy. So I remember when I was just starting out as a master's student, I guess this one's also an indulgence. Second point, though, I only have 3. I was a young guy at Ohio State, and it was February, and who was there? Dr. West. And my friends and I were like, well, we got to go to this. Now, I will say it was not the Horseshoe. It wasn't the 100,000 people, but it was a big auditorium that you spoke at. And my friend and I were pretty far away, and we were like ready to have our minds blown. And I totally remember this. You started with a quote from T.S. Eliot, and we looked at each other like, how is he going to pull this off? Where is he going with this? And I just remember I don't remember every rhetorical move after that. And it's probably not on YouTube, so you have to take my word that quote started there. And it was very inspiring. And I've been fortunate coming here to the Graduate Center to finish my PhD to be in the room with such great people who honestly helped me so much on my journey. So it's a great honor to be here. Then the third and last point, which is why Peter had me here, was it's not an easy time. I was just talking, as a public university, I've been in CUNY. I recognize some people. I got my PhD here, finished in 2004. I've never seen it like this. My home campus, my I'm fortunate to be the acting EO this semester. I'm almost done here at the grad center in the Miles program, but my day job's at Queensborough Community College. So you really know what's going on, talking to the students, whether it's homelessness, the challenges they face, and the buildings are falling down. They're literally falling down. I'm talking ceiling tiles are popping out of the ceiling. So it's a difficult time. And I think as the speakers here today, the seminar, we think about structural changes. I just wanted to put a follow-up pitch in for the liberal studies program, because it's not an easy time for us here at the grad center either, but it's a safe space where people can find their way. And I've been really happy that we've been able to help students who are non-traditional, who really fulfill the CUNY mission to go on to the next stage in their professional lives, their personal lives, and their academic lives. So I would encourage you, if you know of students who may be thinking about a master's program, thinking about a career in activism, maybe just trying to figure out if they are a PhD student, it's a great place. And I would encourage you to consider sending them there. So thanks, and it's an honor to be here today.
Thank you, David. Stanley passed away. It's going on 2 years, almost a year and a half. And we waited to do something until we could all do something live, because we do want to have people face to face and have that energy. And, and for many of us, it's not obviously an academic question. We've worked, I worked with Stanley since 91 or 92 and collaborated and, all these years together. And for many of us, it's more than just a question of books and ideas, but it's also, of course, and fundamentally also about the ideas and the politics. And one of the things that we did together is to create the Journal Situations, the institute where we offer various classes. We do a Marxist summer school in the summers. You can go to the come to Greece for 2 weeks and take seminars in Marxism. And the people, Tom's Diner, the people with the island we go are the people who own Tom's Diner. And they always say, are you going to bring Brother West to the island? I said, sooner or later, he's also going to come to the island. But I would like to introduce Michael Pelias to say a few words on behalf of the Institute for the Radical Imagination.
So, thank you, David. Thank you so much. And I want to welcome everybody. Thank you for coming today. This is a very special event to honor and celebrate the life of Stanley Aronowitz. We're blessed, and I'll introduce him in a second. He'll be speaking, to have Cornel West here to open the proceedings. We have 4 panels planned today, and I think it speaks to the breadth of Stanley Aronowitz's contribution to the world of ideas. We have a panel on literature as social knowledge, a panel on labor and power, a panel on the necessity of philosophy, which was the second chapter of his book of The Crisis of Historical Materialism, and finally, the knowledge factories, since we're getting many of these as plural now, not just the factory. And to me, the Singularity, I think, is a great title for this event. Stanley possessed a uniqueness. He possessed I think a specialness that very few of us ever encounter in our lives. Someone with a great breadth, great personality, great charisma, care, unbelievable. I think this is something that was not spoken about Stanley actively, how much care he had for everybody, even though at times it would not come across, right? The level of care was absolutely profound, and we talked about this many times. Yes, I've read Heidegger on care. Yes, I've read Bernard Stiegler now on care. So this notion is something that I think has been a forgotten moment with Stanley, and the care for ideas, the care for the intellect, which was absolutely spectacular in terms of how he transmitted knowledge to the next generation and the generation before that. And I know in terms of my talks, I was not there when they first became friends, Cornel and Stanley, but I know they spent many hours discussing the Frankfurt School, Georgi Lukács, people that are now only read somewhat in the graduate schools, no longer in alternative study groups, which the Institute for Radical Imagination was formed to do, to give people that opportunity to explore knowledge outside of the traditional educational institutions and develop some kind of radical consciousness. So I welcome everybody here today. I welcome you to visit the Radical Imagination I think it's .institute, the website. We offer many special classes. We're just finishing what is called Thinking on the Transition. Is there a possibility of a transition to thinking and acting into the future? We'll be offering a class on Stanley's crisis as well. That'll be co-taught and many other things coming up on digitalization. We have a new phrase called homo datum, instead of homo sapiens or homo economicus, homo datum. So anyway, I want to introduce, he needs no introduction. I'm going to be, very brief today until the panels this afternoon. I want to introduce the incomparable Cornel West, jazz man of philosophy, a very dear friend of Stanley's. Stanley, when he had the stroke, he couldn't wait for Cornel to visit him. Always look forward to this. And thanks to Jim Vretos for bringing Cornel over at times, and he just loved those visits. I was very special to him in between, of course, the visits from all of his other colleagues and friends, but it was very special to him. And they had a very special relationship. And I'm sure that Cornel will, allude to this and, engage as he often does. So without further ado, Cornel West will open our Singularity of Stanley Aronowitz. Thank you so much.
I'd like to salute dear brother Michael and David and Peter and all of those who have facilitated our coming together. I want to begin by just highlighting the family of our dear brother Stanley. Brother Michael, just stand, no, brother, stand, brother Michael. Stand, brother Michael. Stand, no, brother Michael. Give it up for our, this is the son. Stand, Sister Kim. There they are. No, indeed. This is part. Yes. This is part of the legacy of our dear brother Stanley. And they good looking just like Stanley. We want to, of course, salute also Sister Nona, who's now in Kingston, I think Sister Kim said, and Dory, who was a little precious when Stanley's grandchild. And it's very important, I think, to begin on this particular note because Stanley was always committed to the concrete human being, the fleshified persons, those who are shuddering and suffering and struggling against circumstances not of their own choosing. It is very difficult for me to talk about Stanley because he was such a special person in my life. We knew each other for 45 years. We would meet weekly at Tom's restaurant or a pizza place. And Stanley was just so fundamentally committed to the life of the mind. I don't think there's been a greater intellectual who was in love with working class people and culture in the history of the American empire. Emerging from the proletarian slices of East Bronx, going to PS 57, and then making his way to high school and arts and music, because his precious mother, Frances, was a painter. Brother Jim, you remember that portrait of Stanley had on the wall in his office of his mother? And Brother Nat, his father, working at New York Port Authority, civil servant. He and Stanley going at it in a creative, loving, and complicated way. Brother Michael Denning, we and I were just talking about the dedication of false promises to Nat Aronowitz, born 1905 to 1967, who showed me things and words and helped me find a passion for justice. Now that's a very Aronowitzian formulation, because that's the same father who would give him an ultimatum. You're gonna have to leave this house if you're still involved in all these radical politics. You already got kicked out of Brooklyn College because you wanted to promote the Labor Youth League. And Dean Maloney said no. So what did Stanley do? He left. That's our brother Stanley. Always radically cutting against the grain, 15 years in the labor force as an everyday ordinary worker doing already extraordinary things, because his commitment to the life of the mind and the world of ideas still absolute. Sister Jane, Professor Jane, first marriage there in New Jersey. Stanley's trajectory is singular. I love that word in the title of our gathering. And that's the word he uses over and over again in his marvelous 2012 reflection on C. Wright Mills. C. Wright Mills was a singular figure, not just in sociology, but in the Republic of Letters. C. Wright Mills was a singular person because he didn't capitulate like most of the New York intellectuals, whatever their ethnicity, to the Cold War liberalism, to the US imperialism, to the seduction of the American empire, most importantly, the careerism and the opportunism of the emerging professional managerial class. Stanley never, ever sold out to the powers that be, owing to his integrity, his honesty. I think, for example, of the last page, of page 442, False Promises, where he said, the great socialist Rosa Luxemburg forever tells us to acknowledge the left can only honestly and clearly speak among workers, not lead workers. That's Brother Stanley, fundamentally committed to the tradition that he and I would talk about week in and week out. Hardly in the lexicon, hardly in the jargon these days of intellectuals. It's called the Council Communist Movement. Hancock and Gorder, poet. Henrietta Rowland Hulse, poet. Meaning what? As an intellectual fundamentally committed to the empowerment and the ennoblement of working class people across race and gender and nation. He was an internationalist, one of the few vanilla intellectuals who understood the centrality of US slavery, the centrality of white supremacy in the making of the specificity of the American capitalist civilization. Stanley stands out in so many ways, not because he's pure or pristine. Oh no, Stanley would be the first one to say, given his comic sense of the world. We talk about Jonathan Swift, we talk about Jane Joyce, we talk about my own special artist Chekhov. I had to put Chekhov on because he was obsessed with Dostoevsky. But the sense of the radical incongruity and the contradictions that are shot through each and every one of us, each and every historical moment, each and every movement, and yet he never, ever, ever was thoroughly surprised by the powers that be and never paralyzed by despair. Even the epigraph of False Promises, talking about the Cloaks Workers Union, the union of the bosses. His grandfather helped found that union. Another critique from within the family, but still willing to be himself and ally himself with the needle workers who would talk about Dubinsky and Hillquit and Thomas's. Either workers are making false promises, that's the name of the text, the false promises, by doing what? Preaching socialism and practicing fascism and saving capitalism by the bosses. Typical Aronowitzian formulation, dialectical critique. I am for unionism, but for the most part, it has been a fundamental instrument of capital of the powers that be. I'm associating with the left wing of this movement, and I'm going with them all the way down. So it was also the case in Newark, because Newark became chocolate after the rebellion of 1967. Jane, Stanley, we're staying with these chocolate people. First time I ever heard Stanley speak. I heard him speak a zillion times because I followed him all over the city, just like he followed me to different churches and universities and things. We were brothers, still are brothers. Member of my family. Will be till the day I die. But old brother Stanley would say, Brother West, I did pick up some rhetorical sensibilities by speaking in those black churches, and they were not used to secular Jewish brothers from the Bronx. Feeling my words, feeling my spirit. That was Brother Stanley, with never a note. Just like Hans-Georg Gadamer, never used one note when it came to reflecting on what was on his mind after doing what? Just like a jazz musician. So disciplined, voracious reading over and over again, and then taking off and soaring like an eagle. And self-taught. False Promises was before his dissertation. We don't have an example of that in the history of the American intellectual life, with one exception, Sinclair Drake, who wrote Black Metropolis in 1949 and wrote a dissertation on those leaving the Caribbean to Cardiff, Wales in 1952. Black Metropolis, still a classic to this day. False Promises, our old brother Michael Denny, one of the few, if any, persons who can talk about that to work in light of his own magisterial corpus, because it builds so much on all the complexities and levels of the shaping of American working class consciousness. So I'm going to pull back on that text. But I believe that text remains a classic, very much like E.P. Thompson's Making of the Working Class of '63, both of those texts written when they were in their late 30s. Stanley writes that before his dissertation. Very much self-taught. Almost puts to shame so many of these highly formalized, academicized scholars who gain access to unbelievable privileges and opportunities and still have so little to say when it comes to serious intellectual substance, let alone political courage. You say, oh, Brother West, I could tell he was your friend. You highly biased. No, I'm telling the truth about Stanley. I just happen to love him too. But I'm telling the truth. When the history is written of the rise and fall of the American empire. And we tease out those intellectuals who were fundamentally committed to telling the truth, standing up for justice, being concerned to pursue justice at any cost. Stanley Aronowitz is going to be one of the few. Not because he was right all the time, because he could talk about food, shelter, the American dream early on and be so prophetic. He could talk about education under siege with our dear brother Henry Giroux. It's very important to mention Henry Giroux and all those wonderful texts they did together as he was on the run, had to go to Canada because of the academic ostracism and so forth. My favorite text, The Crisis in Historical Materialism, Class Culture, Politics, and Marxist Theory, one of the most important interventions into the discourse of Marxist theory and praxis in the last 75 years. Honest, preserving a Marxist moment in every movement, but an openness to the woman's movement, the Black movements, anti-homophobic movements, ecological movements, given his deep connection to Murray Bookchin and a host of others who talked about a critique of nature, and then that wonderful dissertation of Science's Power. Ideology and discourse in modern society, when science itself becomes a form of ideology, deeply rooted to the first name he mentions in False Promises in his acknowledgement, Herbert Marcuse, in the Frankfurt School, but also William Appleton Williams in Gabriel Kolko. He's one of the few working class thinkers, historians, who always connected the formation of the working class to U.S. militarism abroad, U.S. imperialism abroad. You know how rare that was then, and too often, with the exception of Michael Denny and a few others, still is rare today. The narrowness, the parochialism, the provincialism of so much of the academy always created deep anger and righteous indignation in Brother Stanley. But what would he say? that has little to do with what our calling is. We had long discussions. Those two great essays of Max Weber in 1917 and 1919 on vocation, Beruf, Wissenschaft as Beruf, science and scholarship as calling or vocation, politics as vocation. And then I pushed on him some Ralph Waldo Emerson. Now, he was not crazy about Emerson. We had a lot of wonderful tussles over that. And the American scholar and the calling of what it is to be specifically an American lover of the life of the mind. And then, like Stanley, also to be a lover of everyday people, working people, poor people, and look at the world through the lens of what Adorno would call the redemptive perspective, from below. Even when it looks bleak, even when it looks dim, you're still concerned with the truth, and the condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak, to be concerned about those voices, not just when they're echoes of the mass culture, echoes of the ideological apparatus of the prevailing status quo, but the voices, when working people find their voices, just like when jazz musicians and blues women find their voices. And Stanley was one of the few intellectuals who was religiously musical and artistically immersed, even as he was still tied to rigorous social analysis. That's what it means to be a thinker with a synaptic vision, capacious imagination, a synecdochic sensibility, concerned about the relation of parts and wholes and the interdependence and interrelation of those parts, and the whole always being more than the sum of the parts. That's anti-specialization. That's anti-careerist. That's de-disciplinizing the discourse. It's not a matter of even interdisciplinary, because that still presupposes separate disciplines. He's de-disciplinizing. He's a thinker. He's not a mental analyst. He's not an academic product of a particular disciplinary mode of engagement. He's concerned about the world, the whole, the sense of the whole, or what his favorite figure of all time, and I'm going to conclude. I know I'm going too long. Georg Lukács. Oh my God. All you got to do is put a smile on Stanley's face by saying, Georg Lukács changed his life. My Lukácsian text. Lukács is going to be he who serves as the launching pad for my critique of Marxism as a master discourse, not in an anti-Marxist spirit, but like Franz Fanon, to stretch Marxism in such a way that it becomes as flexible and fluid as John Coltrane on the soprano saxophone. It's flowing, protean, but still rooted in mode of production, relation of production, that understands culture, ideology, structures of value, structures of feeling, structures of perception, and Stanley's irreducible personality, charismatic, full of so much love of life and language and literature and laughter, so much zest. I used to see Stanley. I said, brother, you provide the answer to the great question of John Keats. Keats used to say, the fundamental question of life is energy or despair. All you got to do is meet Stanley and see Stanley and spend some time with Stanley and know it's about energy. Unstoppable predilection for authorizing alternatives, utopian impulse, energy in his relations, even in his personal dialogues. He could shift from structural analysis of late capitalism to intimate talks about relationships. I said, well, Stanley, that's TMI, too much information for me, brother. But that's Stanley. He was, in the language of my own Black tradition, he had a radical freedom in love. He had a radical love in freedom. He was one of the rarest of free human beings. And his own beloved Dostoevsky used to say, it's rare to find free human beings. Most human beings don't want freedom. They want a piper to follow. They want authority to defer to. Stanley was the opposite. How blessed we have been and will forever be interacting with him and his texts and his legacy and keeping track of his precious family, to know that that brother was somebody who impacted us in our lives. He reminds me of what Montaigne said about Plutarch, the exact words that Nietzsche said about Montaigne. It gives me joy to know that somebody like Stanley Aronowitz walked to earth and gave me wings. And nothing can take that away from me. Unto death, how blessed we are, how important it is to reflect on the singularity of our dear brother, my brother, Stanley Aronowitz.